My name is David Johns, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. The National Black Justice Coalition, or NBJC, is the nation's only civil rights organization that focuses on federal public policy in our efforts to highlight racial equity and LGBTQ+ equality. We acknowledge that as long as there have been Black people, even before the terms existed, we were beautifully diverse and otherwise LGBTQIA+, and understand that none of us are free unless and until all of us are free. The last year or so, which is marked in terms of the passage of time by many people in terms of the murder of George Floyd, should also be acknowledged for including the murder of Tony McDade, who the same week was murdered by the Tallahassee Police Department. Fewer people know about Tony McDade because Tony was a Black trans man. And I say that because what's not new is the trauma and violence that Black people face. But what's often missed, unacknowledged, or ignored is the way in which that violence and trauma impacts those of us who have intersectional identities, those of us who are discriminated against as a result of our race, as well as our sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. And so because none of those things are new, what Black feminists refer to as the measures of domination, the things that allow white supremacy to be omnipresent and yet invisible, our work has always focused on advancing federal public policy to ensure that there are structures in place for people to do the right thing when logic and compassion and competence failed them. Over the last year, our efforts have included doing more to ensure that the violence against our community is not only acknowledged, but that there's accountability. There's specific work around the violence that Black trans women face. We are well on track for this to be the year of the highest murders of Black trans women, outpacing last year, which was the highest. And a lot of that work also includes at this point trying to pass the Equality Act to ensure that there are fair and consistent civil rights protections for all of us on the basis of sex, as a result of gender orientation, gender identity, or expression, and otherwise assumed membership into the LGBTQIA+ community. That's really important because many Americans believe that I have protections as a Black cisgender living man that I do not. The reality is I could be denied access to walk into a store. I could be kicked out of an Uber. I could be denied access to a public housing or homeless shelter. All because one assumes that I'm LGBTQIA+, or otherwise believes that I should not have access to those public rights. And so it's really important for us to pass that piece of legislation. The last thing I'll note is that the last year for us has been impacted, like much of the rest of the world, by the novel coronavirus. And so many of our efforts have included disrupting the misinformation and disinformation that often prevents Black LGBTQIA+ individuals, families, and communities from having access to the resources that can ensure that they will thrive. It's included ensuring the democratization in terms of the delivery of vaccines and other sources of support related to the novel coronavirus. And we've also done a lot of work to highlight critical connections between the novel coronavirus and the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which continues to disproportionately impact the Black community, and specifically the Black LGBTQIA+ and same gender loving community. What can I do at home as an individual, as an American who believes in fairness and equality? And the answer is that right now you can pick up the phone and call your United States Senator and ask them to ensure that they will support the passage of the Equality Act. The Equality Act has been voted out of the House of Representatives successfully in at least the last dozen congressional sessions. It was recently voted out of the House of Representatives, and it now sits in the United States Senate. And what we know is that in particular, members of the Republican caucus need to be persuaded to do what is right, to do what is in the best interest of America, acknowledging and celebrating the plurality of diversity that makes our country beautiful and strong and vibrant. And so asking them to do their job in representing you by passing the Equality Act is what you can do. The second thing that I want to note is that it's really important to pass legislation, and that legislation is made more meaningful with direct, everyday interaction. And so I would encourage everyone to think about ways to increase your competence, to learn about what it means to be a member of the LGBTQIA plus community to develop meaningful, intimate, I didn't say romantic, but intimate relationships with people who have diverse experiences, and then use that knowledge to otherwise hold space to increase your compassion. If we do all of that, then we will be stronger and better together. NBJC was really excited about and continues to be excited about being a beneficiary of the Can't Cancel Pride work. And a couple of the ways in which the resources were put to good use were to support our advocacy efforts. Over the last year, we spent a lot of time focusing on increasing education and supporting empowerment so that people showed up and participated in the presidential election and in local elections connected to that. We did a significant amount of work and outreach to also increase participation in the 2020 census. We know that Black people and LGBTQIA plus people are disproportionately less likely to participate in census or other federal data collection processes. And so we utilize those resources to develop messages and otherwise engage in partnership efforts to address that problem. We focused a lot on increasing amplification of what we call stolen lives. That's the work around the violence that Black trans women face, and have also worked to ensure that this current administration is much more engaged in accountability for the violence that we know about. The resources were also used to support the National Black Justice Coalition's Youth and Young Adult Action Council. This is a cohort of a dozen young people who are brilliant and who are committed to ensuring that all Black people have the opportunity to thrive. And they used their time and energy together to accomplish three things that are noteworthy. They, one, developed messages for other LGBTQ youth to ensure that while we were shifting and responding to and understanding what was happening with coronavirus, that other members of the community felt seen and valued and affirmed for showing up just as they are. They also worked with Cartoon Network to develop a comic strip to normalize understandings of, as well as the use of, gender pronouns. And then they also worked to support cultural competence efforts, responding to calls from corporations and schools and institutions of higher education to answer the question of how they could be not only anti-racist, but be competent in ways that acknowledge intersectional oppression. And so we're super proud of all that the Youth and Young Adult Action Council has accomplished, and thankful for the investment that allowed them to be able to do that important work. I first met Sage, Dolan, Sandrino almost 5 years ago to the date. She was a participant at the inaugural White House Summit for African American LGBTQIA plus youth. And this was an event that was designed to acknowledge and then address the sad reality that too often Black LGBTQIA plus youth are neglected and ignored, especially by policymakers and by educators who might be well-intentioned, but are not always supported in being as thoughtful as they possibly can in making space for, in finding ways to be affirming of, and otherwise ensuring that children from multiple marginalized communities are safe and protected and affirmed and feel loved. And Sage was a participant at this summit where we invited, and we as the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans and NBJC invited almost 100 youth to Washington, D.C., where they were the experts and were centered in a process of making recommendations to educators and to policymakers to ensure that they were supported cognitively, socially, and emotionally. Sage was one of the first young people to take the mic. I will never forget her, not only because of her brilliance and the clarity with which she spoke about addressing the needs of so many brilliant babies who are too often ignored, but because she had this big afro that also symbolized her physical strength. And Sage talked about what it meant for her to be an Afro-Latina trans student and the responsibility that she was clear that the adults around her had to ensure that she felt safe by addressing things that she was responsible for naming, but that had existed well before she had been born. And I'm really thankful that the National Black Justice Coalition has been able to maintain a relationship with Sage and provide a platform upon which Sage could continue to grow and sharpen existing and develop new skills and relationships, all tethered by her acute understanding of the responsibility she has as a leader, the unique gifts that come with that existence, and a timely presence that allows her to be effective at delivering messages about equality and justice and equity to audiences in particular who purport to care about those things. And so I'm really delighted that Sage accepted the invitation to serve as a member of NBJC's Youth and Young Adult Action Council, They do a lot of advising, which is necessary. And I am incredibly excited about the life and careers, multiple exclamation points, that she has ahead of her. Too often, we only speak about Black trans folk, FOLX, or trans folks more generally in times of tragedy or crisis. Some people acknowledge Trans Day of Remembrance. Some people will acknowledge Trans Day of Visibility. More recently, there have been public media-sponsored opportunities to learn about or at least celebrate trans and non-binary identities vis-a-vis wonderful offerings like Pose. And still too few Americans have meaningful, intimate relationships with individuals who have trans experience or trans-identified folk. And a result of that is that trans people face attacks that they should not face, that are the tip of often the spear of hate that is targeted at many, if not most of us, given how diverse we are in the ways that we show up as Americans. And in spite of all of that, trans folk, as is the case for Black, queer, non-binary, gay, lesbian, I use the term same-gender loving to center love, and my love of being both African and same-gender loving. Black trans folks live at the forefront of efforts to ensure that we can all thrive and be free. And so Give Them Their Flowers is a campaign designed to help everyone else appreciate that, to ensure that people are aware of the efforts of trans folk and non-binary folk who are doing things that are designed to, and in many ways, benefit them. And hopefully enroll others in accepting the opportunity and leveraging the resources they have to increase their competence and compassion to do the same. When thinking about Pride 2021, my message to Black members of the diverse LGBTQIA+ community is to guard your joy. It is our responsibility, especially at this moment of crisis, to ensure that you do that which will allow you to not just survive, but to thrive, to feel happy, to frolic, to rest at the space where your purpose meets your passion in ways that aren't tied to work or to labor. And I hope that you can do that for yourself first before you continue to do that which most of us do, which is to do it for others. To other members of our community, our non-Black siblings, my message to you is similarly to guard your joy, and while doing so, to accept the responsibility and opportunity you have to leverage your privilege to contribute to the effort to ensure that there's recognition of the fact that Black lives matter, not only by ending police violence against Black people, again, in diverse ways, but by passing legislation like the Equality Act to ensure that all of us are protected, at least federally, from discrimination, and taking opportunities every day to do something, small but meaningful acts to affirm living in a community where each of us has not only the promise or potential of, but a real chance at existing without the threat or fear of violence or discrimination or stigma. I fundamentally believe that when all of us are free, we will truly be able to celebrate fully